Today, we're in the Caribbean and headed up to the highest point on the Isle of Enchantment.
Hello, I'm Skye Marthaler and welcome to Rooftops of America. Today we're in beautiful Puerto Rico and headed up to the highest point on the island. But before we start this adventure, take a moment and click that red subscribe button below and the bell icon next to it for all the latest Rooftops of America updates.
Puerto Rico's highest point, Cerro de Punta, is found in the heart of the Cordillera Central, the major mountain range of Puerto Rico. The island itself is found in the northeast of the Caribbean Sea, part of the Greater Antilles, where it is the smallest and easternmost of the major islands of the chain. Covering an area of 3,515 square miles makes Puerto Rico larger than both the states of Delaware and Rhode Island combined. Overall, it is the third largest island in the United States.
Puerto Rico sits right on the boundary of the North American and Caribbean tectonic plates. As you may expect, throughout its history, the actions of these two plates as they slip past each other has greatly influenced the island. Even today, Puerto Rico regularly suffers from this tectonic activity, even in the form of earthquakes.
It was the interaction of those two plates that created the island about 185 million years ago. Puerto Rico is basically the top of a long fault and fold ridge pushed up by the plates. This ridge is rather substantial, stretching from Central America through the Greater Antilles and continuing down through the Lesser Antilles.
It's easy to see why Puerto Rico has been nicknamed the Island of Enchantment. This is a beautiful place. What we find here today is a rugged tropical landscape that is made of three distinct geological regions, and each of them has played a role in the island's history. You have the coastal lowlands, you have the karst or carbonate region, and then you have the area we're most interested in, the Cordillera Central, the mountains.
While the other two regions are worth exploring, particularly the karst region, a truly unique landscape, our attention is focused on the mountains. The Cordillera Central runs west to east, 110 miles long, effectively cutting the island into two halves. The mountains here are not as high as other locations in the Caribbean, but their vertical relief makes them appear larger and taller than they are. The Cordillera Central is mainly composed of igneous and sedimentary rock, formed through a combination of factors. As mentioned earlier, the first was the interactions of the two plates over the course of millions of years, leading to faulting and folding. As the plates slipped past or under each other, it forced the crust upwards.
The second, from volcanic activity. About 120 million years ago, during the Cretaceous period, the Cordillera Central was nothing more than a series of small islands being uplifted. But surrounding them were other active volcanic islands, and they left debris scattered across the landscape of what would eventually become Puerto Rico.
One of the best remaining examples of this can be found in the northeastern part of the island, in the shape of El Yunque, itself the remnant of one of the largest and most active supervolcanoes in the region.
Ecologically, the Cordillera Central is home to some of Puerto Rico's greatest natural treasures. Much of the flora and fauna that are found on the island are unique to it, and some of the rarest of those species are found here in the mountains.
The range splits the island into two major zones. You have the wetter side to the north, with more rainforest-type vegetation. On the southern side, you'll find a drier environment. The slopes of the mountains are home to a variety of forests, to include cloud forests, dwarf forests, and Puerto Rico's moist forests.
All of these are unique environments that are totally worth checking out if you have the time. Humans have called Puerto Rico home for at least 5,000 years. The oldest culture that's been identified so far is a group of people referred to as the Oroid. Archaeological digs on the island have identified several sites where they established settlements, but little else is known of these people.
Eventually, this group would be replaced by another tribe around 400 AD called the Igniri. Several centuries later, they were followed by yet another tribe that would eventually be the ones who would first encounter Europeans, the Taino.
The Taino were thought to have become the dominant culture on Puerto Rico around 1000 AD. Now, Taino isn't the name they called themselves. It was given later in the 19th century. Originally, though, as a group, they hailed from South America. And before their migration to the island, they lived along the banks of the Orinoco River in northern Venezuela.
By all accounts, they were a thriving, well-developed, polytheistic, agricultural society with an established political structure. They called the island Boriken, meaning land of the brave Lord.
Religion was an important aspect of Taino life, and one of their most holy sites was the mountain of El Yunque. It may well be the most famous mountain in Puerto Rico. The mountain itself is actually a bit of an outlier because technically it's not part of the Cordillera Central, but the San Luquillo Range instead.
As mentioned earlier, El Yunque is the remnant of a supervolcano named Hato Porco. El Yunque is the name given to it by the Spanish, meaning the anvil, due to its interesting appearance. The Taino, though, referred to the mountain as Yuki, meaning white lands, due to the clouds that gather around the summit.
Regularly shrouded in mist with a distinct appearance, this place just exudes sort of a mystical aura. And the Taino felt this too. And with that in mind, they attributed this place to being the home of one of their most significant deities, Yukahu.
Yukahu was the god of agriculture, peace, tranquility, and fertility, and was said to live on the mountain where he battled his opposite, Guabansex, the god of chaos and disorder. These battles were Yukahu protecting the Taino from hurricanes Guabansex brought with him.
You can pay a visit to El Yunque by stopping in the Caribbean National Forest, itself a unique location, being the only tropical rainforest in the U.S. forest system. But you're going to want to plan ahead and reserve your spot, because during the weekends and tourist season, there are only a limited amount of people allowed in on the main corridor.
The Taino presence can still be seen and felt on Puerto Rico, and there are a variety of historical, cultural, and archaeological sites you can visit. If you have the time and inclination, you can follow the Taino route, a tour that takes you from the north of the island to the south, stopping at some of the most significant sites on the island. If you're more limited on time, one of the places I would recommend is the Caguana Ceremonial Ball Courts. This complex was built around 1270 AD, and the ball game they played here was incredibly popular throughout the Caribbean. It's thought to have been related to the ball games of Central America and Mexico. This particular version was played as far west as Cuba and all the way east to the Bahamas. The games played on these courts are thought to have had a ceremonial element to them as well. Since almost all historical accounts derive from Spanish sources, the true nature and purpose of the game is still debated. But there is a line of thinking the game may have been a way to resolve disputes in a more peaceful fashion. Most of the surviving sites that have been found are actually on the Virgin Islands and here on Puerto Rico. The Caguana site is one of the largest of them. It's worth coming here, if only to catch a brief glimpse of a society that would be irrevocably changed at the close of the 15th century. The first Europeans to set foot on Puerto Rico were the Spanish. Columbus landed here on his second voyage to the New World on November 9th, 1493. He named the island San Juan Bautista, after St. John the Baptist. Columbus wouldn't stay, though. After 2 days, he sailed on towards Hispaniola to establish Santo Domingo.
For the next 15 years, Puerto Rico may have been left alone, but it was not forgotten. What brought the Spanish back was the same thing that drove much of their exploration of the New World: rumors of gold.
It fell to one of Columbus's lieutenants, Juan Ponce de Leon, to follow up on these rumors. If that name sounds familiar, Ponce de Leon is often associated with the Fountain of Youth and leading the first European expedition to Florida. His first efforts, though, were here in the Caribbean. Ponce de Leon arrived in Puerto Rico in August 1508 and established the first European settlement at Capara. Ponce de Leon was then named the first governor. The Capara settlement was temporary, only lasting a year until a more ideal spot was decided on near the natural harbor. This new settlement would be named Puerto Rico de San Juan Bautista, though most people commonly referred to it by the latter half of the name, San Juan, which stuck. The large island took on the first part of the name from the town, Puerto Rico.
The gold that drew the Spanish back to Puerto Rico was quickly exhausted, and they soon turned to more agricultural interests like growing sugar cane. But in the Spanish Empire's eyes, Puerto Rico's real value wasn't in agrarian interests, but instead its strategic location. See, Puerto Rico was ideally situated to be the first line of defense and the gateway to the Spanish Empire in the New World.
Perhaps nothing exemplifies the importance the Spanish placed on Puerto Rico than the Spanish fortifications surrounding San Juan Harbor. These stone monstrosities still loom large even to this day. Spain started fortifying the harbor in 1539, at the location where the fortress known as El Muro currently sits.
Puerto Rico was very much the front line of Spain's Caribbean empire, and the port of San Juan was its epicenter. This was particularly true in the 17th and 18th centuries, when other European powers like the French, English, and Dutch were trying to establish their presence in the New World. Each of them was more than willing to challenge the Spanish hold on its conquered lands.
Puerto Rico was the front door to the Spanish Main, and San Juan was the key. It was the first major port of call for any ships sailing from Europe to the Caribbean, where you could resupply, take on fresh water, and repair your ship. If you controlled it, you could protect or raid the Florida Straits, the route the Spanish treasure fleet sailed every 2 years to bring back to Spain the wealth of the New World.
For me, the place that really drives home just how important Puerto Rico was to the Spanish Empire is this place right here, the Castillo San Cristobal. Compared to its counterparts around the harbor, this place was built rather late, constructed in the mid-1700s. It was built in response to attacks by the Dutch and English. And if you get here and you're standing on the walls, you'll quickly notice that it wasn't oriented towards the sea. No, this place is oriented to defend San Juan from land assault.
Unlike its harbor counterparts, Castillo San Cristobal was built to defend San Juan from land attacks. Designed in the Vauban Star Fortress style, this was the largest fortification the Spanish Empire ever built in the New World, and one of the definitive examples of 18th century military engineering in the Americas.
Walking among these fortifications today, whether El Morro, San Cristobal, or the other harbor fortifications, you really get a sense of just how much capital Spain was willing to invest to hold on to Puerto Rico. These are significant construction projects.
The Spanish fortifications continued to be used throughout Spanish rule and even afterwards into the 20th century. The U.S. Army made additions to them in the shape of coastal observation platforms and even a bunker during World War II.
The Spanish just weren't here militarily and economically, though. Along with them came the Catholic Church. After all, the Spanish conquistadors, they came to the New World for gold, glory, and God. And that third element was just as important as the other two, and it would have long-term ramifications for the island.
The Catholic Church quickly realized this was a golden opportunity to expand its reach, and they were soon involved with colonization efforts as well, under the guise of saving people's souls. In 1511, Pope Julius II established 3 dioceses in the Western Hemisphere to help make this a reality.
Puerto Rico would play a prime role in the start of this religious expansion. Not only would it be one of the new dioceses, but it would also serve as the headquarters for both ecclesiastical functions and the dreaded Inquisition.
The newcomers' relationship with the indigenous Taíno rapidly deteriorated as Spain moved to use the native population to exploit the land, a key element in the encomienda, a brutal system of labor where conquered non-Christians were forced to work. In turn, they received the benefits of military protection, education, and conversion to the Catholic faith. With the switch from agricultural activities that merely supported the colony mining operations to a more commodity-based one, the Spanish required additional manpower. They filled this need with human slavery. African slaves were brought to the island as early as 1513. Institutional slavery would remain in effect here for the next 360 years, finally being abolished in 1873.
The Taíno rose up in 1511 against their Spanish oppressors, but Ponce de Leon crushed the revolt. For the Taíno, it was effectively the end of their hold on Puerto Rico. Over the next couple decades, their society and culture was slowly erased. It was estimated there were 30,000 Taíno when the Spanish arrived, but by 1530, a census was conducted and only 1,148 remained to be counted. Many died to disease, starvation, or suicide. Those that survived fled to the mountains or to the neighboring islands in the Lesser Antilles.
Those remaining survivors were assimilated into the new colonial structure, with many Taíno women marrying Spanish men. Despite this, the Taíno and their heritage never quite vanished and have left a significant and long-lasting mark on Puerto Rican culture.
If you really want to get a sense of, Spanish colonialism in at least the United States, then I would recommend walking along the streets of Old San Juan. It really transports you to a different sort of place. It's colorful, it's vibrant. It just gives you that little glimpse that I think is so essential, the feel for the place. Throughout the Caribbean, sugar was king, and it was no different here on Puerto Rico. Most of the agricultural efforts of the island were dedicated to the production of sugarcane. But there was another crop that would make Puerto Rico famous, and it was known as black gold: coffee.
Coffee, as a beverage, started in Eastern Africa and the Middle East in the 15th century, where it gained popularity and notoriety. By the mid-17th century, the beverage had taken Europe by storm, with coffee houses cropping up in many of the major metropolises on the continent.
With the demand for this dark beverage skyrocketing, there was significant interest by European powers to find new areas in which to produce it and thereby profit from it. Along the way, they hoped to break the hold the Ottoman Empire had on the market. The Dutch had success in Indonesia, but it was here in the Americas where there was the most potential. And coffee's arrival, well, it would change the world.
There is the fanciful tale of Gabriel de Cleux, a French naval officer bringing coffee to the New World in the form of one sapling stolen from the tree gifted to Louis XIV. But the truth was coffee was already being grown in the New World by both the Dutch at Suriname and the French in Haiti.
That said, de Cleux had great success in establishing coffee forests on Martinique. And it would be these trees that eventually spread across South America and the Caribbean, to include Puerto Rico, with the Spanish bringing Martinique coffee saplings to the island in 1736.
At first, coffee production here was small scale, with most of the beans produced only making it as far as the local population. But that was to change. By the latter part of the 18th century, the Spanish crown recognized the economic boon coffee provided, and it began offering incentives and tax breaks to farmers to grow and export it.
Additional decrees from the Spanish crown to bolster coffee production soon followed, and more importantly, they paid off. Coffee production on Puerto Rico became a booming enterprise. By the end of the 1700s, the island was producing over 1 million pounds a year. Puerto Rico was never the largest producer in the Caribbean, but the coffee from the island built a reputation as some of the best tasting in the world. It soon became the preferred coffee for the papacy, and other European royal courts followed suit.
What made Puerto Rican coffee so good involved a combination of factors. First was the choice of bean. The coffee grown here was 100% Arabica, with a sweeter, smoother taste. Plus, the island had the perfect climate for growing this type of bean.
And then there was Puerto Rico's secret weapon: its terrain, particularly the mountains in the Cordillera Central. Their steep slopes, natural shade, altitude, and volcanic soil all combined to produce a bean of exceptional flavor.
By the 1800s, Puerto Rico's coffee industry was at its zenith. But by the end of the century, things took a turn for the worse. Puerto Rico was racked by multiple hurricanes that devastated the coffee forests. Adding on to that was another event, one that would have long-term consequences for the island: the Spanish-American War. To understand how Puerto Rico became a U.S. possession, we need to look west at Cuba and its struggle for independence. By the late 19th century, the Spanish Empire's Western Hemisphere holdings, once encompassing vast areas of territory in both North and South America, had been reduced down to just 2 islands, Cuba and Puerto Rico.
American interest in the Caribbean was nothing new. The U.S. had long looked southwards to extend its reach in what it felt was its natural sphere of influence. There had been the idea floated around of purchasing both Cuba and Puerto Rico during the 19th century, but it never really moved beyond just an idea.
By the late 19th century, the Spanish Empire was a mere shadow of itself, whereas the United States was taking its first steps onto the world stage. While politically, Spain may have ruled Cuba, economically, U.S. business interests controlled the country, having purchased huge chunks of land and investing millions of dollars into sugar production. In 1895, the Cuban War of Independence commenced, its third attempt to break free from Spain. After 3 years of fighting, the conflict would eventually escalate, with the United States intervening, the catalyst being the explosion of the cruiser USS Maine in Havana Harbor.
This was the incident that American imperialists wanted to seize and emerge onto the global stage. War was declared, and for the next 10 weeks, the American military would fight the Spanish in both the Pacific and Caribbean.
While a majority of the fighting was centered on Cuba, Puerto Rico was not excluded. The United States had designs for the island, best summed up by Theodore Roosevelt in a letter to his friend, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, writing,
"Do not make peace until we get Puerto Rico."
Fighting would begin in May, with the U.S. Navy blockading San Juan Harbor, and then shelling happening between Navy ships and the forts guarding it. Originally, the Americans were to invade from the north, but General Nelson Miles, commander of the invasion force, had other plans. On July 25, 1898, Robustiano Rivera spotted the American invasion force from the Guanica Lighthouse, where he was the keeper. Rivera was quick to notify the local military authorities, but to no avail. General Nelson Miles would land with several thousand men unopposed. He'd be joined by several thousand more in the following days.
Over the course of the next 18 days, American forces would start a four-pronged assault to take the island. By the time the armistice between Spain and the United States was signed on August 12th, American forces held almost half of it, enough that Spain relinquished control.
With the signing of the Treaty of Paris, 4 centuries of Spanish imperialism came to a close. While Cuba was set up as an independent nation with certain concessions to the United States, that option was never put forth for Puerto Rico. It would be established as a U.S. territory, basically trading one form of colonialism for another.
The United States coveted the island for basically the same reasons the Spanish had. Militarily, it was still one of the primary strategic strongholds of the Caribbean, and economically, the sugar production of Puerto Rico was too valuable to let go. On top of that, it would be a useful outlet for the excess manufactured goods the U.S. was producing.
The U.S. military would control the island until 1900, when civilian control was reestablished. 17 years later, Puerto Ricans would be granted U.S. citizenship. But it wouldn't be until 1946 when Puerto Rico would finally have a governor who was native-born.
Over the past 125 years, the relationship between the island and the United States has, at times, reached points of crisis. Independence movements that had started under the Spanish regime continued after the change of ownership, and there would be uprisings in both 1935 and 1950. Even today, there is a vocal contingent lobbying for Puerto Rican independence.
In 1952, Puerto Rico passed a constitution that created it as a U.S. Commonwealth. It allowed them to independently conduct their own affairs and to elect their own leaders, but they were still shackled to U.S. economic policy.
Which brings us back to coffee. After American occupation, the coffee industry in Puerto Rico was once again relegated down in importance. At the turn of the 20th century, Americans weren't the coffee-obsessed culture they would be 100 years later, and really had no interest in what they perceived as an expensive drink.
Despite these setbacks, Puerto Rican coffee was still considered a premium brand. In the middle of the 20th century, the Vatican alone was buying 1.5 million pounds. Unfortunately, change was on the horizon as Puerto Rico shifted from an agrarian economy to one based in manufacturing and tourism. This was a move that would prove detrimental not only to coffee, but it would break the dominant sugar industry as well.
Puerto Rico's coffee industry weathered the storm for a while, forming a cooperative of coffee-growing haciendas, but natural disasters and restrictions and regulations imposed on the island due to its territorial status meant it always was kept at a disadvantage. These days, Puerto Rican coffee is a different story. The coffee industry on the island is dominated by big business, particularly Coca-Cola, and they have cut the quality of coffee by mixing it with lower quality foreign beans.
You can still find artisanal and specialty coffee growers up in the mountains of Puerto Rico, and they're definitely worth checking out if you have the time.
Puerto Rico in the 21st century is a vibrant island with a proud people who celebrate a rich and at times tumultuous heritage, though it still suffers from long-term problems, many exacerbated by its colonial status. While it has a degree of self-autonomy, it has limited representation in Washington, D.C., and while legally considered Americans, often they get treated as second-class citizens.
There have been more than a few times where Puerto Rico and its people have been treated as an afterthought. One of the most recent is the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in 2017. Another thing that hinders the island is the Jones Act, a relic of the early 20th century that dictates how cargo is transported by sea. This piece of outdated legislation is particularly burdensome to U.S. territories.
Of particular interest is what status its future holds. On one hand, of all the American territories, Puerto Rico is the one that could most likely achieve statehood. On the other, there's still a desire for independence, to be able to chart their own path forward. It is, after all, the only Spanish colonial possession in the Americas that never gained its own independence.
Make no mistake, though, over its time as a U.S. territory, Puerto Rico has greatly influenced American culture. This island and its people are a key part of our national tapestry. Perhaps nothing quite sums up Puerto Rico's current status than one of its newer landmarks.
There is a statue here on Puerto Rico called Birth of the New World, just outside the city of Arecibo. Standing at 360 feet tall, it is not only the tallest statue in the United States, but in the Western Hemisphere, and the fourth tallest statue in the world. It is a controversial monument, to say the least.
It celebrates Columbus's arrival in the New World, which, while a significant event in human history, was for many people neither a good nor beneficial one. Puerto Rico has borne the brunt of that since 1493. There's a bit of an allegory here that despite this massive hallmark of colonialism standing near its shores, that it absolutely pales in comparison to the wonders of the island and its people.
We've seen how Puerto Rico's mountains have played an integral role in its culture and history. But what about its highest point? Well, truth is, Cerro de Punta as an individual peak is, well, rather uneventful, with one caveat.
The peak itself, like much of the Cordillera Central, is non-volcanic in origin. That mountain there is really nothing more than just the highest point along a very large ridge. Even the name, Cerro de Punta, which may sound exotic to English speakers, just means pointed tip. But there is one thing that sets Cerro de Punta apart from every place else. It's home to an incredibly rare species of fern found nowhere else in the world.
Located right at the border of Yayuya and Ponce municipalities, getting here can be a bit of an adventure. You'll want to take the Ruta Panoramica, a 160-mile scenic road that spans the island, cutting a path along the central mountains.
This is not a route for the faint of hearted, but a steady pace will get you up there. One of the things, though, if you do go this way, that you'll quickly find out is this is a Puerto Rico that not a lot of visitors to the island really get to see. The mountains in all their glory. And there are some absolutely breathtaking views to be had up here.
You'll want to start early to maximize your chances for a successful outing, since it may take longer than you think to get to Cerro de Punta, and it affords your best chance to get a clear view, since by the afternoon, the summit starts to cloud up. You'll find the trailhead at kilometer marker 17.2 on the Ruta Panoramica. Quick side note, Puerto Rico measures roadway distance in kilometers, not miles, so take that into consideration. There is no obvious signage, you are in the correct spot, but the gravel and grassy lot is a good indicator that this is where you should park.
One of the things you're going to quickly realize when you get here is that it's a bit colder. On average, it can be anywhere from 10 to 15 degrees cooler here than it is down on the coastal lowlands. So, you're going to want to take that in consideration before you head up.
When it comes to reaching the top, the service road for the communications towers is the most common way for most folks.
The trail to the top of Cerro de Punta is actually this road behind me, which, to be honest, looks more like a double-wide sidewalk than a service road. Now, technically, you can drive to the top, but I would strongly advise against it unless you have a vehicle with four-wheel drive and high enough clearance. The road's not necessarily in the best of condition. Even then, I'd encourage you to do what we're going to do today and walk up. Let's go check it out.
While the road up is only 2/3 of a mile, or 1 kilometer if you prefer, and pretty straightforward, as you'll see when you head up, it is steep, narrow, and in rather dire condition. You'll at least want to wear a good pair of shoes for it.
This is a steep little hike up this road. It just keeps going up. Let me show you a little bit of why you wouldn't want to necessarily drive this. Human interaction with Cerro de Punta is a bit of a mystery when you look back through time. Of course, these days, it's the destination for highpointers. And, you know, the communication towers on top, that's all 20th century. But if you look further back to the Spanish, we don't know if they ever made it up here. There's no records of it. The Spanish tended to be more interested in the slopes of the mountains for coffee, sugar, stuff like that. And then if I was going to put my money And the first people to ever ascend to the top of Cerro de Punta, it'd be the Taino. That culture had a strong affinity for the mountains, as you see with like El Yunque. So it wouldn't be any surprise to me if the Taino were the first to make it up to the top of Cerro de Punta.
Once you get close to the top, you may wonder where the actual high point is. Continue heading towards the third tower. On the left, you'll find a set of stairs tucked sort of in the back, taking you further up. Once at the top, you will see a concrete block. Congratulations, you've reached the top.
Once you get off the road, you're gonna walk by the platform, come to the back of it, and you're gonna see the stairs. And then you just head right up these, and you're at the top.
While the actual summit area itself is not necessarily the most charming, the views you can get up here more than make up for it. This place is touted as having some of the best views in Puerto Rico, and on a clear day it's easy to see why. You can take in almost the entirety of the island. It is incredible.
And here we are on the summit of Cerro de Punta, the rooftop of Puerto Rico. With an elevation of 4,390 feet, if Puerto Rico were a state, this would be the 27th highest state high point, slotting in above Black Mountain, Kentucky, and below Mount Mansfield, Vermont. But as it stands, this place has a different title. Cerro de Punta is the highest territory high point in the U.S. for both major and minor territories. I'm Skye Marthaler. Thanks for joining me on Rooftops of America. Before you go, leave a comment and click those like and subscribe buttons below. And I'll see you soon.